Tonight, which is interesting, or I really should say tomorrow, is Shiur B'Tammuz. That's what tomorrow is. Tonight is the, sort of like the before Shiur B'Tammuz. So I thought it would be interesting, in a certain sense, to talk a little about Shiur B'Tammuz, sort of like talk about what I think is very significant on that day, So before I begin, let me just say that this shiur should be a blessing and a merit for the health and success of the families of Regina Bas Yosef Reuven and Yeshaya ben Yisrael ben Yamin Wolf ben Tzvi Hirsch and Baruch ben Yamin Wolf. Shiur should be an aliyas neshama of these people. In any case, what we're really doing, obviously we're entering the period of what's called the 3 weeks, which obviously culminates in the 9 days, which ends really with Tisha B'Av, So we're familiar with the concept of Tisha B'Av. And obviously the main concept of Tisha B'Av is where the first Beis HaMikdash and the second Beis HaMikdash were destroyed, actually in the same day, Tisha B'Av, which is the 9th day of Av. So really what we have to think about is what the concept of Churban really is, and some of the ideas that are connected to the idea of Churban, And one of the things that I want to mention is there some type of a consolation for that? And I believe there is. And in fact, it even has a name, Shabbos Nachmu. And the question, of course, is, other than the fact that we read a Haftorah on Shabbos Nachmu, and that's why we call it Shabbos Nachmu, because the Haftorah that we read has, Nachmu, Nachmu, Ami, and so on. But I believe that there's something much more important, that Shabbos is really the Nechama of Tisha B'Av. And the one that comes right after Tisha B'Av really is the Nechama of Tisha B'Av. Now, of course, the question is why? We know what Shabbos is in that sense, but what does that have to do with Tisha B'Av? And I will talk about that, a little later on. But the first idea is, what exactly is the Churban? Or what is Churban? Well, it's interesting that there were 3 basic days in which we experienced tremendous Churban. They were cataclysmic events, right? But each one has some type of a commonality with each other. And in the end, that's really what Churban is, as we will see. The first day of Churban is Rosh Hashanah. Most people don't recognize it as such, because as far as they're concerned, Rosh Hashanah is the day, that Adam Harishon, the first man, was created, right? But also on that day, he sinned. Now, I had mentioned certain ideas in the last couple of weeks, which is really very fundamental, it's foundational, and it's really what Churban is really all about. You see, if you recall, I said that there are different states of reality. The first one, which is the greatest, is the concept of Ein Sof, which I mentioned, right? Ein Sof. It means it's the reality of God, which we really have no idea. Ein Sof means infinite. We have no idea what the reality of God is. Not at all. But what the Rebbe did is he created another reality that allows something else to exist besides himself. And that's the reality of what's called the Zulosoi, that there can be another being besides God. Because I mentioned that one of the main ideas of the Ribono Shel Olam, of the Ein Sof, is that Ein Mevadoi, right? An infinite being does not allow the coexistence of anything else, because that clearly would limit his infiniteness, obviously. You see, he's infinite, so how can there be something else that would in some way limit him? Can't be. So the concept of an Ein Sof fundamentally is that he's an Ein Milvadoi. Besides him, there is nothing else. But in some fashion, we don't know how at all, obviously, he created a reality in which there can be an other, you see. And that's the reality of the Zolosoi, you see. Okay. And I mentioned that the being that occupies that reality is the Neshama. The Neshama is the Zolosoi of the Ein Sof, you see. Now again, we have no idea how that happened, but the Neshama is the greatest creation that God made. And the way he did it, which we know, as I mentioned, is that he emanates 10 spheres, and those spheres are really looked on as the embodiment of the divine. We don't know what they are, but in some way they are that which God uses to create or to bring into existence things other than himself. And what they create initially is the Neshama. So the Neshama is the greatest form of Zolosoi. Then what the Rebbe Shem did, actually he did by taking the energy or the ore, the light of the spheres, so he reduced the light and he made a neshama. Then the Rebbe Shem reduced the energy of the spheres further, and he made what's called the spiritual universe. And the spiritual universe is Ruchni, and that's the universe, as we will see, of Olam Hazeh, of the Malachim, the angels, and so on. So that's what he did. So in a certain sense, that's a third reality. Now, therefore, then what the Rebbe Shem did is he created man, or he created the guf of man, the suit, so to speak, that man would wear, which is, I mentioned, I think, last time, and that was the guf. That's called Geshem. It's called materialism, material, Geshem. If you want, you can use the word physicality, but it's not the physicality that we know, but it is Geshem, material or physical. And that is different than Ruchni or spiritual. The spiritual reality is a completely different reality than the physical reality, you see. So that's reality number 4. Now in that reality, what was the task of man? The task of man, and he took the neshama, he inserted it into the reality, right, into a body. The body is not what we have. It's not the same. It was pure physical material, which we do not know what it is. And what Adam was supposed to have done, right, is by doing certain behaviors, mitzvah, whatever, he would take the geshem, the physicality of that reality, right, and purify it, remove its physicality, and he would actually transform that body which he had. It would become, we don't really know what it means, but it would become the finest type of physicality ever witnessed. If you want to use it, would be completely transparent, very fine. It's almost like you would have a body of pure light. Now light is physical, even though we can't see it and so on, right? But it's the purest form of reality or physical reality, you see. So what Adam was supposed to have done is turn his body, whatever that was, into a super fine physical body. That's called zikoch. Mezakech, he would have to purify his body from a gross physicality into super fine physicality. And like I said, we have no idea what that means. We will know what that means, because that's exactly what we have to do, not now, but later on. But then something happened, and this is the churban that I relate. You see, what happened was he sinned. Instead of doing what God wanted, which is not to eat from that tree, right, knowing good and evil, he ate from the tree, he and his wife, Chava. So what they did is they introduced in that physical realm, right, some aspect of another being called the Satan. And the Satan can project what is called Zoyama. It's some type of a force, but it's a contaminating force. You see, it's the opposite of spirituality. So what happened is that the body of man became physical, but it was physical pervaded by the Zoyama. Now I've mentioned this before, and that's us. So we know that what that is. We have bodies that have the Zoyama, right? And that Zoyama is the grossest form of physicality, you see. It's almost like looking at an element, let's say like uranium or metal or whatever, a higher atomic number, and comparing it to hydrogen, which is much purer, it's much simpler, and so on. Now, that's what he did, and as a result of all this, he is now physical / Zoyama. You see? And that's not pure Geshem. But that was a Churban. Why? Because what he did was he distanced himself further from the Ribono Shel Olam. That is Churban. You see? Because it's like to be next to God, to Ribono Shel Olam, is pure existence. We don't know what that means. We will know in Olam Haba. But to be attached to God is the greatest type of existence that can ever be. So wait a minute, if you're now introducing in whatever you are, in this case it was Adam Rishon as pure Geshem, fine. So he was encased in this physical body, but the body was very fine, not like what we have. Therefore he's much closer to God. You see, he can experience the Ribono Shel Olam at a much greater level. But what he did is by introducing Zoyama, or the Satan, and therefore changing his physical body with the mixture of Zoyama, he now becomes much further from the Ribono Shel Olam. Well, guess what? That's Churban. It doesn't look like Churban, because you can just say, well, he just transformed himself into a different type of being. You know, a being of pure physicality that can be, changed into a body of incredible, subtle physicality, and he just introduced some substance called Zoyama. No, much worse. Because the Ribono Shel Olam, because a body that has Zoyama cannot be purified. This is the problem. It has a contaminant. So you cannot purify the contaminant. You got to get it out of the body. You got to throw it out. You got to get rid of it. This is the problem. In the old days, Adam can purify his body, where his body changes or transforms, right, back into spirituality, whatever, and ultimately into a pure form of physicality, and he restores himself as a Zulosoi, as an incredible being. You see, but once you introduce Zoyama, you cannot purify Zoyama. You see, you got to get rid of it. Therefore, he changed the nature of the work. But what he did at the same time, you see, is he distanced himself from the Ribono Shel Olam. That's Churban, because he is now much worse of a being. He's subject to death, subject to disease and illness, subject to stress, all kinds of demons. That's what he's subject to. You see? So that itself is Churban. That it's no longer a bed of roses. Now he's got to go through a living Gehenna much of the time, because he's now really physical, subject to decomposition and so on. But the real tragedy is he's now much further from God. Like I say, because you cannot purify Zoyama. You got to get rid of it. In fact, that's the reason why people have to die. You see, because you can't purify Zoyama, yet we are all filled with it. So what happens is death had to ensue. How or why? Because the person would then die, and his body would then turn back into earth, and therefore at that point in time he's no longer the human that he was, and therefore the Zoyama is no longer part of him. You see? So now when the Rosh Hashanah now reintroduces him back into the living physical, he would get up with a new body without Zoyama. You see? And that would be incredible. No Zoyama. And then at a certain point in time, the Rosh Hashanah would say, okay, Neshama, do your thing. And he would take off the shackles off the Neshama, and the Neshama would immediately purify, mezakech, the physical body. Why? Because there's no Zoyama. So that's not a problem anymore. The only problem is he's got to do the zikuch. He's got to purify, right, and remove the geshem. And that it could do. You see? That's the whole reason why we have Tchias HaMesim, why we have resurrection of the dead. You see? Is to get rid of the Zoyama, and then the Neshama will purify the body. You see? But the Churban is that man changed himself into a much worse form. So that was, Rosh Hashanah was an incredible Churban. You see? Remember, Churban or destruction or whatever, what it means is to disattach yourself from God. That's what Churban is. Everything else is all relative. Real Churban is you're no longer part of God or attached to the Rosh Hashanah. You see, that's real Churban. Now, looking at Churban that way, right? So what was the next time of Churban? And the answer is Shiva Asa B'Tammuz. Today, or I should say tonight, tomorrow. Why? Because without going into the whole thing, I have a whole series of shurim about Pesach. And Pesach, the essence of Pesach, is that the Jews were able to render inert the Zoyama in the physical body. You see, which was incredible. The Gemara says this. Nifsika Zoyama shel Nachash, that the Zoyama of the Nachash, the snake, right, which we had in our body, was Nifsika. Nifsika means it ceased to operate in the body. All that had to be done now was to evict it from the body. You see, they had rendered it inert, which is incredible. And that was what the holiday of Pesach is about. Now, with whatever labor they had, whatever Yisurin they had, however they did it, it was the first time in history that mankind, in the form of the Jews, was able to influence, neutralize, or nullify the effect of the Zoyama. So therefore, as a result of that, they were not normal. They were not like us. They had Zoyama in them, but it was completely neutral. We've got Zoyama in us and it drives us crazy. You see, so much of what happens to us is because our bodies have this incredible contaminant called Zoyama. You see, so therefore, they were at the point of evicting the Zoyama. You see. And therefore, what they should have done as a result of that, if they would have done that, then Moshe Rabbeinu would have been the Mashiach, because that's really what his designation was, you see. And they, therefore, would go through the process of the Messianic era, which is Moshe Rabbeinu giving the Torah. And we know that the Torah that Moshe Rabbeinu really gave, at first, the Luchas Rishonis, the first tablets, is really the Messianic light. But what they did is they did the sin of the golden calf. Now, I had spoken about that, so I'm not going to do it again, not now anyway. And because of the sin of the golden calf, right, they allowed the Zoyama to reactivate. Bad news. So in a certain sense, they replicated the sin of Adam Arishan. You see, he's the one who allowed the Zoyama to enter the human body, change the material structure of man. And now, in Yud Zayin Tammuz, because that was the day they did the Chet Egel, they had allowed a Zoyama that they nullified and almost evicted. They now allowed that to reactivate, you see. So the Zoyama was reactivated, and there you go. Because it's reactivated, everything comes back, death and so on, you see. So therefore, Shiva Asa B'Tammuz, right, again, reactivated the Zoyama and therefore created a tremendous distance between the neshama, which is now imprisoned, so to speak, in the human body, and God and the Rebbeinu Shalom. So people don't realize Shiva Asar B'Tammuz is the greatest tragic day after Rosh Hashanah, not Tisha B'Av. People don't understand that. They think Tisha B'Av is the worst day. I mean, we'll see in a minute that it is obviously bad. It's not the worst day. The worst day, like I pointed out, was Rosh Hashanah. You see, because it brought in the Zoyama. Shiva Asar B'Tammuz did the same thing. Therefore, it created the greatest distance between the Jews and God. Okay? And as a result of that, it is the greatest Churban besides Rosh Hashanah. Then, of course, you had the third day of Churban. What was that? Where it's not that the Jews created a tremendous barrier between them and God by reintroducing the Zoyama. You see? They created the barrier. Okay, that's one type of destruction. It was just like them building a wall that now separates them from the Rebbeinu Shalom. But the Rebbeinu Shalom is still there. You see? It's just that they separated themselves, right, by reintroducing this contaminant of the Satan. Tisha B'Av is different, but in many ways, it's the same Churban. Why? Tisha B'Av is where the Rebbeinu Shalom removed himself. He left, for whatever the sin was. The first one was the 3 sins you were supposed to give your life for, whatever the Gemara says. And the second reason is because of basically sinas chinam, lashon hara, and so on. But the Rebbeinu Shalom left. He removed the Shekhinah, you see, and that had profound consequences to the Jewish people, because that would mean that on a national level, we no longer had the access or the ability to attach to God. What's interesting is that, and we don't know what it is. When you had that first Beis Hamikdash, you had the Oren, everything was there. You had items, components that were miraculous. They were incredible. Like the fire of the Mizbeach would go up, right? And no hurricane could move it. You had a lot of miracles. No woman ever lost a child because of the meat smell or whatever. There was so much stuff going on there and so on. There were no insects. And basically, the whole courtyard of the Beis Hamikdash was a butcher shop, if you really think about that. You know how many flies congregate around a butcher shop? You see? Nothing. No insects, no flies, no mosquitoes, no nothing. Could you imagine that every Jew would say, or the Rebbeinu Shalom would require, every Jew to go 3 times a year to the Beis Hamikdash and to bring a korban? Now, there are many ideas of that, what that means. I always like to think of the idea that it means that the Rebbeinu Shalom, he wants his family. It's like a father wants to see his kids. So even though you may live in, let's say you live in Hebron or whatever, oh no, you got to come and visit me 3 times a year. That's one of the greatest expressions of the love that the Rebbeinu Shalom has for the Jewish people. He insists on getting together. It's like a family reunion day, so to speak, where you would acknowledge the presence of God by being in different korbanos and so on. But that's basically what it was. That meant that when you went to the Beis Hamikdash, you could actually feel something. You can feel the Shekhinah. You could feel the presence of another being. You didn't know how you felt it, but you felt it. You see, because the Rebbeinu Shalom was really there. There was a level of intensity of the Shekhinah that we don't even understand present in the Beis Hamikdash, in the first one and even in the second one. But certainly in the first one where you had the Oren and so on, it must have been incredible, to feel that, you see. And like I say, that ended on Tisha B'Av. So God left. That's what he did. And that is a Churban, because it meant that you are now distant from the Rebbeinu Shalom. Again, same concepts of Churban. Now, it's interesting. If we want to know, where does this concept come from? Where does the concept of Churban come from? You see, how do I know that what Churban, destruction, really means is the absence of God, or the detachment from God? Well, let's just check out Cain. Cain revealed exactly what it was. What happened with Cain? Well, he offered something, fruits or whatever, and his brother Hevel also offered, but he offered real great sheep or whatever. And you see, and the Hashem, whatever that means, he regarded the korban of Hevel much more than the korban of Cain. And somehow Cain knew this, and so on, and he was very jealous, right? And he went and, we know, committed the first murder in human history. It's amazing, killed his brother, fratricide, and so on. So Hashem appears to Cain, I mean, this is the beginning of Bereshis, and he tells him, where's your brother? What do you mean? Am I my brother's keeper? And all of a sudden the Hashem said, your brother's blood cries to me from the ground. And the Hashem in a certain way cursed him. So it's interesting to see what Cain said. So Cain at least didn't deny, he couldn't deny what he did. But what he did was great. He admitted that he sinned terrible. In fact, to such a extent, Cain said, God la'avoni min soy, that my sin, or my punishment, whatever, is greater than I can bear. You see, in other words, what I did is greater than what I can carry. You see, so in a certain sense, and he admitted it was a tremendous sin. So in a certain sense, he was asking for Rahmanas. So listen, people deserve punishment, but you can't give them a punishment that they can't even bear, because that means instant death. And maybe that's what he deserved. But then he said something which is very interesting. And I will be hidden from your face. I will be distant. You're not going to have anything to do with me anymore. You see, it's interesting. That's what Cain regarded, in a certain sense, as a punishment that was greater than he can bear. You see, and from your face I will be concealed or hidden. Means you'll have nothing to do with me, right? And therefore, in no way can I attach myself to you evermore. And that's greater than I can bear. Cain knew that was the greatest churban. And he was just in a certain sense, visited by that, churban. And he admitted, and he said that he couldn't bear it, and so on. But Cain understood. So, it's funny, you tell that, you just think, imagine if the Hashem appeared to a murderer and said that to him. You don't have to go very far to find murderers in the United States. Forget about the rest of the world. They're all over the place. You can just check out New York if you want to find murderers, or many cities in the United States. And the Hashem said, how do you go kill? How many murderers would say, well, I can't take the punishment, and one of the main ideas of the punishment is I will be detached from you. Really? People don't think about that. People don't have that hasog of their Hashem. They don't miss God, and so on. So it's funny when you think about that. As bad as Cain was, could you imagine what he really was before he murdered Hevel? He must have been on an incredible madrega even to recognize that this is a terrible punishment. You see? From what he said, you can see what type of a murderer he was. He must have been an incredible, just got caught up in the jealousy, whatever. You can see the level, the madrega of what he was. You see? Of what he was before the murder. Which is interesting. But in any case, the main idea is that is the churban. You see, Cain, when he says that. In other words, the real churban is the richok, is the distance that you have from God. And to increase that distance is the churban. You see, and like I say, those 3 days, Rosh Hashanah, the entry of the Zoyama, Yud Zayin Tammuz, the re-entry of the Zoyama, and the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash, which is Tisha B'Av, those are the 3 days that clearly, essentially reflect what the Churban is. So at least we have a grasp of what we are really talking about, you see. Now, as a result of that, we don't realize something. And I want to talk about it, the greatest richuk that we will ever see, is happening now. We don't realize that. We are in a time, a terrible time, that is already predicted as the era before the Mashiach comes. We are in what's called a battle between good and evil. We're not looking at bad people, good people, and so on, no. We're looking at the whole concept of evil versus the concept of good. Who will win out? So in that sense, it's one of the greatest dark periods in human history, you see. And it's interesting, there was a very great Gadol, Rabbi Elchanan Wasserman, who was the greatest student, Talmud, of the Chofetz Chaim. And right before World War II, whatever the year was, right? He went to England, you see. And this was, I think, because he was in Yeshiva Baranovich, whatever, and he had a yeshiva there, and you already had World War II going on. You had Hitler already rose and so on. In any case, so he went to England, probably to raise money or whatever, and they begged him not to go back to Germany or to Europe, Austria, wherever he was. Actually, he was it Austria or Poland? Whatever it was, anyway. And they begged Rabbi Elchanan Wasserman not to go back to let's say it was Austria. Okay. So he told him something very interesting, He told him what the Chofetz Chaim said. And he wanted to show that it will not help. The Chofetz Chaim said something very interesting. And what he said was Ruach HaKodesh. It's obvious, What the Chofetz Chaim said was something very, very interesting. Here's what he said. He said the war of Gog and Magog will not be just a war, one war and that's it. It will be in 3 parts. This is what the Chofetz Chaim said. There will be 3 wars aimed at the Jewish people, or they will be the end war, you see. The first one, he said, was, and this was during World War I, that the Chofetz Chaim said this. Chofetz Chaim, I think, was nifta in 1933, at a very old age. But during World War I, he told this to Rabbi Elchanan Wasserman, and this is brought down by Rav Elia Lapian in one of his forums and so on. So the Chofetz Chaim said that this war that we are having isn't just a regular war. It is the first stage of Gog and Magog. He saw Germany as Gog and Magog, and it was World War I, you see. Now, even though it wasn't directly against the Jews, but it destroyed, I think, over 1,000 Jewish community. It was terribly destructive and cataclysmic to the Jewish people. So the Chofetz Chaim actually said, this is the first stage of the war of Gog and Magog. He identified World War I as Gog and Magog. Then the Chofetz Chaim said, and already this is Ruach HaKodesh, he said, there will be a stage 2. And that stage will be directed against the Jew. He was predicting World War II, I think in like 1916 or 1917. I mean, that's what he was saying. There will be another major war, more specifically aimed at the Jew, and that will be the war of Gog and Magog. Again, you see? And it will bring terrible calamities. So what Rabbi Chon, and then he said the third stage, it's interesting. Everybody's waiting like, what's the third? The Chofetz Chaim didn't say. He said it will ultimately happen, you see. But what's interesting is that he identified World War I and World War II as messianic, which would mean obviously that how could they be part of Gog and Magog, right? That means they have to be pre-messianic, or else they could never be. But he said that there would be these two wars, World War I, and he predicted World War II as a messianic war, Gog and Magog. You see, we can ask, well, where's the third stage, right? Third stage is really, in a certain sense, happening. What happened in the second stage, which is World War II, is the Sultan brought out a messianic figure, his messianic figure, which means a person of one of the most evil people that ever lived, you see, which we know is Hitler, Yamach Shemai. That's what he brought out. In that sense, he represented pure evil. That's what Hitler represented, pure evil, you see. And that war was specifically to destroy the Jews. That was the real process, that was the real rationale of the entire war. Hitler was really not so much interested in conquering the world, although I'm sure that was sort of like part of his agenda. But his real agenda was to destroy the Jewish people. And we see that because that's what he wrote in his book, Mein Kampf, which he wrote in 1923. He actually says it. The Jews must be destroyed. They are the evil of mankind. That's what he believed, and so on. And in that sense, if the Sultan had to appoint, right, his representation or representative, Hitler would be that representative, because that person probably is one of the most evil people that ever lived. Not many people can claim that. I mean, there are some other people, you know, who their whole interest was to destroy, true genocide, the people because of who they are, not because of, in a certain sense, of what they did, you see. So so World War II was clearly aimed at the Jews, and that is the Messianic war that he spoke about, and so on, you see. Now I believe that that war absorbed the brutality of the Messianic war of Gog and Magog. In other words, there still will be a Gog and Magog war, which I will talk about, right? But it will not have that brutality. That has been absorbed or fulfilled with World War II. I mean, 6 million Jews is beyond belief. And it's not just that they died, you know, it's the way they died. Every aspect of the Jew was used. His skin, his fat, you know, his possessions, everything. It was just, that was never done in history. I mean, you had enemies, so you killed them, okay. But you don't do this. They're not even enemies. How many Germans did he kill? And so on, you know. It was purely in order to destroy the Jewish people. That had never been done in history. All wars are fought because of a specific rationale, right? But you don't have a war that's fought basically to kill a person because of who he is, not what he does. In any case, but I believe that the third Gog and Magog, like I say, the brutality and the slaughter of the Gog and Magog war, without getting into it, has been accomplished with the Second World War and the First World War. The third Gog and Magog war will be the same concept, which we'll now understand to be the ultimate battle between good and evil. That's really what we're looking at. That's really what Gog and Magog is. The ultimate battle between evil and good, or good and evil, whatever, and so on. I believe that was the founding of the United Nations as a collective of the entire globe, the entire world. And I think they were created in 1946, right after World War II. The gematria of Gog and Magog is 70, and the UN is a body that represents all 70 nations, even though there seem to be more nations, but there are 70 original roots of all the nations of the world, and so on. And today the UN, I think, has 193 nation members, and so on. But there are really only 70 roots. And I believe that Gog and Magog of today is really that which unites the entire world, is the United Nations. And in many ways they have shown that's exactly what they are. is that almost all resolutions that come out of the General Assembly condemn Israel. It's very obvious what the UN is. And that is the war of good and evil. You see, that's really what it is, in any case. So the Chofetz Chaim is, like I said, he was hinting that there are three parts of the war. Now, if you really think about that, you see, in terms of what it means, we also have the same idea. Three parts to the final battle. The first possible messianic period of time, which could have ended, like I say, and we will understand what the final battle of good and evil is when the Jews left Egypt. Like I said, they had nullified the Zayama, which means that they had brought very close the Messianic era, and that had they not sinned with the golden calf, right, then Moshe Rabbeinu would have been Mashiach ben Yosef, and so on, right? Now we know, right before that, Mashiach cannot come unless there's a final battle between good and evil, because that's how it ends. So where was the final battle? In Egypt. The final battle was Kriyas Yamsuf, right? The Egyptians were tremendously subdued, right? They were destroyed, basically, right? But wait a minute. They're resurrecting themselves. Nope, they're not giving up. They went after the Jews. So by Kriyas Yamsuf, that is the equivalent of Gog and Magog, because it's right before the Mashiach, possibly, and there has to be a battle between good and evil, final, you see, and before that messianic, and there was. That was Kriyas Yamsuf, and they were destroyed, you see. So we now begin to realize that, that Gog and Magog itself means the final battle between good and evil. So that was the first time, you see, okay. Then you have, of course, like I said, you have ultimately Gog and Magog that will war against the Jewish people, especially Mashiach ben Yosef, because that's really who he's directed against, and so on. And that also will lead to the final battle. But I'll tell you something, what's interesting is we look out today, right? We look out today in terms of what is happening. And if you really begin to think about it, what we are watching is the final battle. Because mankind has descended into the most evil and corrupt. We don't necessarily look at that, but take a look at what's happening in America and the whole world. I'm not even talking about China and Russia and Korea as Iran as incredibly evil nations. I'm not even talking about terrorists and so on, But look at America. I mean, America is supposed to be, right? It's like Abraham Lincoln said, America is the last great hope of mankind. Because even he realized what this world is. And he was hoping that America will provide a model of goodness to the world, you see. But what happened? Now, what is interesting is there seems to be a remez. Yesterday was July 4th. July 4th is the birthday of the United States. When did that happen? In 1776. That was the birthday of the United States. July 4th, 1776 was the Declaration of Independence, which is a very interesting document, and so on. I believe it was divinely inspired, because it's a magnificent document describing something which really almost has never been described. The concept that everybody has unalienable rights, and they have the right to freedom and the pursuit of happiness, and so on. But in any case, what's interesting is that July 4th, 1776, was Shiva Asar B'Tammuz. I once mentioned this a long time ago. Wait a minute. That means the birthday of America, right, was on a day that for the Jews was an incredible Churban. That's what it means. So what it seems to portend is something very interesting, you see. That July 4th, 1776 is not only the worst day for the Jews, because it allowed the re-entry of the Zoyama and destroyed a messianic attempt, but it's also the birthday of the United States. And what is so in a certain sense, right, that day, which is a terrible day, seems to also portend that it's a messianic day, which in many ways is a very interesting concept. What does that mean? In a certain sense, I believe that America was born that day because America will be the final battle of good and evil. America carries that futuristic event where the final battle of good and evil will take place in America. Why? And I mentioned this many, many times. We know that Esav is a patriarch. We know that. I've said that many times and so on. You see, the problem was Esav, the brother of Yaakov, became an incredible Russia, evil person. We know that. You see, so what Yitzchak did is he didn't want to take away the ability of Esav to do the part of the tikkun. So he said, okay, you will persecute Yaakov and his descendants if they get out of hand. So your purpose will then be to allow them to do the tikkun by giving them a kapara, which is the persecutions. So what he did, in an incredible way, he kept Esav as part of the tikkun process, that he will allow Jews, the descendants of Yaakov, to bring the geula. You see, but he does it in a negative way. Fine, but we know what it says in the Torah. V'rav ya'avoy tzo'ir, and the older will serve the younger. You see, that means the older, who is Esav, well, that was a prophecy given to Rivka, that the older will serve the younger, that Esav, who is the older, must serve the younger. What is serve the younger? Bring him food? Show him a good time? No. Serving the younger means to help do the tikkun. That's the only meaning, really, in the Torah. That means in the end, Esav must go back to his original task, which is also doing the tikkun in a positive way, not merely a negative way. Therefore, we see, very interestingly, that this is the job of Esav. Esav must help Yaakov do the tikkun before the Mashiach comes, so he will be able to get the credit. You see, now, therefore, in the end of time, Esav will help Yaakov do the job. But wait a minute, Esav is evil. So how in the world is it possible to Esav to help Yaakov do the tikkun? He's evil through and through. I mean, take a look at who represents him. There's Rome. How many people did Rome kill? For what? Just for conquest? And even the evil people of Christianity, how many Jews did they slaughter, or other nations, in their zeal to take over the world, and so on? You see? So we know basically, by and large, the people that represent Esav, and that's who it was, right? And so on, that many of them have done, not all of them, but many of them have done terrible evil deeds. I don't want to go through the history of Rome or Christianity, but you can't believe, what these people have done to the Jewish people for the last 2,000 years. But in any case, the main idea is, so how in the world can Rav Ya'avoy Tzoya? That's a very good question. Because Esav is really evil. And the answer to that is there will arise somebody who is Esav, who's good. Or else they can't be. Now, America is basically the only real country that's good. So that's why America now has the task. You see? America now has the task of being the final battleground of what? Of good versus evil. You see? Because America is, in many ways, the greatest nation. It's certainly very good, or at least was good, whatever. You see? So good is really found in America. But what about the evil of America? You see? You need the evil, because what's the battleground? You see? So that, what you're really looking at is America has now come into, and that's why its birthday is Shiva Sabbatamos, you see, which is messianic. Because on that day, evil entered, the Zoyama entered. But on that day, the prophecy is, you see, not for nothing were America born on one of the greatest tragic days of Judaism, right? Because America, I believe, is the last stand right before Mashiach. So in a certain sense, Goyg and Magog, in a certain sense, is based in America. The UN, by the way, happens to be in New York. That's where it really is, and so on. But who is the good of America? Who is the good of Esav that battles Esav? So what we're really looking, because of this, the duality here, the dualism of the personality of Esav, that part of him is evil, right? And there's another part of Esav that is good. There's a Ra Sheba Esav and a Tov Sheba Esav, and they will battle, and that will be in many ways the last stand of evil before it completely is annihilated. And I mentioned many times, I believe it's Donald J. Trump. Now, Trump is not a tzaddik. I mean, I've mentioned that. Obviously, he's not a tzaddik at all, you know. But that's not the key component of Esav in the sense that he's good. The key component is you have to be honest. You know, of course you can be a Baal Gaiva, haughty, and insolent and so on. You know, of course you can be a Baal Taiva. That's what Esav is. But the major aspect of Esav that is evil is his dishonesty. You see, that he couldn't care less about the evil that he does. You know, and when you think about it, I don't want to have to get into a situation where I'm praising Trump, but Trump basically is very honest. You see, he's a very wealthy man, and he's an honest guy, you know. But what the Rebbe Shem did is very interesting. He allowed the evil of Esav to come out and to dominate. We are looking at the evil of Esav, and the evil of Esav is the Democratic Party and its representatives. I mean, we're looking at, you know, the President Biden, we're looking at the Democratic Party, we're looking at the liberals and the progressive. It's insane. You know, I want to tell you something. Anybody who comes to America and is honest, right, about what he sees, cannot believe what's going on. You know, there's always a contest between people. But how could there be a contest where you are trying to utterly destroy the former president of the United States? Everybody sees that. They're not interested in solving a crime. They're interested in destroying Trump. So they have to look for a crime. You see, that's what's happening. Everybody can see that, because the Trump mania to destroy Trump is not natural. It doesn't make sense. It's never happened in history. You see, it doesn't make sense. It never happened with any president in history, where the whole objective is to wipe out, to destroy, annihilate the president, the former president. For what? You don't like the guy, okay, you don't like him, fine, so what? But his policies were great. And he did a tremendous good amount of the stuff for the United States in terms of the economy, foreign. I don't want to go through his whole litany of things that he did. So if you don't like him, fine. But why will there be people that want to destroy him? They're looking for a crime desperately to pin on him, to destroy him. That makes no sense. It's irrational. It's never happened before. What must we conclude? This is divinely orchestrated. That's what it means. When you see something that's completely out of whack, completely abnormal, never happened before, you see, and we see it. The amount of indictments against this man. I mean, the guy he becomes president, you already indict him, you already impeach him twice. You know, I mean, for what? For a phone call? I don't want to go into the whole absurdity of what they did. But it's irrational. If you ever read Alice in Wonderland by Lewis Carroll, this is what he wrote about. This country is Alice in Wonderland. You see, it doesn't make sense. You know, I'm not going to go into the irrationality of Alice in Wonderland. It was an incredible allegory against England. But the main idea is that, what are you doing this? You don't like him, so don't vote for him. What are you trying to annihilate him, his family, and his followers? How many times does Biden get up there and condemn the MAGAs? What's wrong with this guy? We're looking at 75 million people. What is wrong with this person? You see? Okay, so don't vote for him. Why are you trying to destroy him with irrational stuff? And all of this stuff is ridiculous. Put away a guy because he's got documents when he is empowered to keep the documents and what do you call it, and declassified documents. This is ridiculous. And not only that, you don't hear a peep out of the guy investigating Biden. Nothing, and it's already more than 6 months, right? And Biden was VP, and he was a senator when he took documents, which is completely illegal, and it's a felony. Nothing, you don't hear a word. I'm not going to go into the absolute ridiculousness of the whole situation. What I'm trying to bring out is, what are we looking at? We are looking at the end of time. And the end of time is not only messianic, but the requirement as that evil has to have its last stand. There has to be a final battle, and that's really what Gog and Magog is, as I've demonstrated and so on, you know? So, in many ways, we are looking at the final battle of good and evil. The Democratic Party representing the evil, and Trump and whatever he stands for representing the good. You know, like I say, Trump is not perfect, but that has nothing to do with what he's tasked. And you see, we don't understand. The Rebbeinu Hashem wants Esav back. He wants Esav back to do the tikkun. And what is interesting is that there's a parsha in the Torah which we just passed, Chukas, where if you take a look at Rabbi, Moshe Rabbeinu is trying to pass certain countries with the Jews. Anyway, he comes to Edom. Edom, of course, is Esav, and the forerunner of Rome, and so on. And he says to Edom, we want to pass your land instead of going around it. So he wants to try to persuade them with an argument. It's an interesting argument, but it's a profound secret, the argument. What does Moshe Rabbeinu says? So Rashi mentions, why did he bring this argument? What's the argument? So he says, thus says your brother Israel, because Israel is the brother of Esav. He says, listen to this. And Rashi says this. Our father, Yitzchak, right? Or rather Avraham Avinu, he had the task that he had to go into a land, right? That they didn't know then it was going to be Egypt, and be there for hundreds of years as slaves. You see, for whatever the tikkun process was, that task or responsibility to do the tikkun process was on both of us, Yaakov and Esav. Moshe Rabbeinu says this. It was Yaakov and Esav. What do you mean? How could this task of doing this as part of the tikkun process, right, be on Esav? Because Esav really is a patriarch. That's what Moshe Rabbeinu is saying. So what happened? Your father, or your founder, Esav, threw off the yoke, and he said to Yaakov, you take that. Means you will be in Egypt, not me. So he threw off the whole yoke of the tikkun process. And that was the beginning of how he left Judaism and so on, you know. What do we see from this, Rashi? That Esav has a task of tikkun. He should have been another nation in Egypt, also as slaves, doing the tikkun process. As Rashi says this, because Esav is also an Ov. That's what we see. Now, did the Rebbeinu say, okay, Esav, you're out? No. Because it says, Rav Yavo Tzoyer, that the older must serve the younger, which means first he'll serve them, which is what Yitzchak said, you will punish or persecute Yaakov and his descendants. Like this, you give them a kapara, which means that they're doing the tikkun. But that's not what it says in the pasuk. He has to serve them in the tikkun process. And that's what Moshe Rabbeinu says to Esav. At least let us go around your land, because we're the ones who took on the task of tikkun by being slaves in Egypt. So we did your dirty work. So at least let us go around your land. That's what Moshe Rabbeinu was saying. Of course, Esav, Edom said, no way. If you do that, we're going to make war with you and so on. Fine. Okay. So therefore, which is very interesting, like I say, America was born on Shiva Asar B'Tammuz. Why? Because Shiva Asar B'Tammuz is a day of enormous tragedy among the Jewish people. But at the same time, it portends the greatest tragedy of all, which is the end of time, which is when all the nations, right, when that will be the final battle between good and evil. You think about that, it's really incredible when you think about that. And that's what is happening. America's at war with itself. Don't kid yourself. There are Americans that hate Americans. It's no longer, well, I don't like your policies. No, there's enormous sinas chinam, hatred of one part of Esav to another part of Esav. The good part of Esav, as represented by Trump and the MAGA, and the bad part of Esav, which is the Democratic Party. And if you want to understand what evil is, we have never encountered the destruction of youth. They are destroying the youth. I don't want to even go into what's happening, the pronouns, the transgender. All this stuff is destroying. And it's just incredible to hear, what the public schools are doing to children, 7-year-olds, 8-year-olds, 5-year-olds, and so on. This isn't normal. You need to use a different pronoun, and now it's in your face, parades, and so on and so forth, This is not normal. And I'm not even talking about the crime. All the cities, I just saw Walmart is closing 150 stores in Chicago, which is their headquarters. Why? Because of the shoplifting. They've already lost $3 billion in terms of shoplifting because they're not in any way convicted. Nothing. They're not brought to criminal. Did you ever hear anything like that? You can shoplift anywhere in the United States, but make sure you don't take more than $1,000. This is sick. It's more than sick. It's not rational. What America has become under the Democratic Party is completely irrational. Makes no sense. What we have to ask is, wait a minute. This was never part of the character of America. Why is it happening? So that's what I'm telling you. This is the last battle of good and evil. That's what we're looking at, you see. And it has to be done by Esav, which is America, you see, because that's their job. You shirked Egypt, so the Baruch Hashem says, you got to come back, right, and finish off the job. And that is Rav Yahvoy Tzoyer. It's funny, I wish I was exaggerating, but every time you open up the TV or the news or the internet, you can't believe what is going on in the world outside of us. I'm not even talking about the countries that are purely evil, but this is the America? Who can believe what is happening? In any case, I do want to mention also, what's the nechama for this? So I will tell you what a nechama is. A nechama is what? I told you what the tragedy is. What tragedy is richuk from the God, is distance from God. That's what tragedy really is. And that is Rosh Hashanah, Shiva Asar B'Tammuz, and also Tisha B'Av. That's the richuk. And that is the greatest of all tragedies. Because God is life. God is existence. And if you're distant from it, you got real problems in terms of your eternity. That's the destruction. But then if that's the case, what would be the nechama? And the answer is, God comes back. Which phenomenon is it where you are attached to God? And the answer is prophecy. You don't realize that. But prophecy is the reverse of Tisha B'Av. Why? But prophecy is what? It's not on a national level. That was taken away on Tisha B'Av. But do you know that every Jew basically can have prophecy every weekend? I mentioned last week or 2 weeks ago, whenever it was, that what is Shabbos all about? Shabbos is where you experience, you get a neshama yasera, which means automatically the aspect of your neshama that's called ruach is opened up. The consciousness, you see, and it actually can access what's attached to, which is Olam Yetzirah. But that's Nevuah, but it's a minor Nevuah, because you can feel something ruchni coming out of that Olam Yetzirah. You can't see God, you see, but you can feel. Shabbos allows you to feel something that you don't feel during the week. That's prophetic, you see. So when the Jews had Tisha B'Av, when we have Tisha B'Av, what does that mean? We lost God. He's now gone. All of a sudden there's Shabbos, and said, wait a minute. If he's gone, why am I feeling him? How am I connected to Olam Yetzirah? Because of my Neshama Yesera on Shabbos. So it comes out that Shabbos is Nachmu, but in a completely different way. Not only because we read Haftarahs, you see. No, the whole experience of Shabbos is to feel God, you see. But of course you have to do the halachas, because that's the condition. But if you do, then you will connect to Olam Yetzirah, which is what's called the Elef Hashvi, which is called the 7,000th year. And that's why you feel different, except it's more minor. You don't see God or anything like that. And I mentioned also them, and that's one of the reasons why we say Shalom Aleichem, because the ones who are on Olam Yetzirah are Malachim. And if you're conscious of their residence, guess what? You could talk to them. Okay, they don't answer you, that's true. But once you occupy, or you are conscious of their domain, then you can address them, even if they don't answer you. And that's why we say Shalom Aleichem on Shabbos. Notice, we don't do that any other way. You see, because only in Shabbos do we get to experience God in Olam Yetzirah, which is really very interesting. You see, so that's why Shabbos Nachmu, a real primistige answer, because Shabbos is a prophetic experience. That's why Shabbos Nachmu, I believe, is called Shabbos Nachmu, because people don't realize Shabbos is the real prophetic experience. It doesn't equal this experience we had in the Beis Hamikdash, but the fact that we can have Shabbos means that God is still with us, or else we could never experience that Olam Yetzirah. You see? And that's why, that's in the Nechama. So it's almost like God is saying, don't worry, I'm still with you. Not only that, but you will experience me, you see. And by the way, just to mention, that's why we have a Shalom Zocha. Why? Because when the infant, the neshama, is put into the guf, it has an incredible existential anxiety, because it's been separated by God. It no longer has access to the Ribono Shel Olam, you see, because it's now in the guf, and it cannot transform the body and purify it. That's the decree. So there's a tremendous, what's called existential anxiety, because it is separated from God, you see. And therefore, what happens when Shabbos comes? There it is. The neshama, even at that point in time, gets the neshama Yesera. But the neshama Yesera is its ability to reconnect to the Ribono Shel Olam, Olam Yetzirah. And that's why we have Shalom Zocha, almost as if to say to the infant, don't worry, we realize you've just gone through a traumatic experience by being encapsulated by a guf. That's true. But guess what? We're making a Shalom Zocha. It's almost like you need to be pacified. You see, you need to be okay, because why? Because God is still with you. And the proof of that is what you're feeling on Shabbos, which is a prophetic experience. Beautifully answers what a Shalom Zocha is really all about, you see. In any case, we now understand the concepts of tragedy. We understand the concept of, what it really is, the concept of Shabbos Nachmu. We understand something also very important, what the nature of the times we are living in now. And the nature is very important. It is the battle of good and evil. And that's why you are witnessing such unbelievable psychosis. It's just incredible what is happening. And the descent of man into unrelenting evil, the immorality and so on. Thank you.